I'm currently I'm working on a project which has basically to do with the impact of climate change on Australian bushfires from mid 19th century to 21st century. The focus of the project is on the fictional writing of the writers like Ellen Clessy, Anthony Trollope, H.G. Weston, and H.G. Wells, which have, which are stimulated. Their writings have been stimulated by several other, along with their writings have actually stimulated by Australian bushfires, while the fictional writers like Mirel Joshua, Jennifer Mills, and Alexis Wright are moved to express their concern for climate change and its impact on the bushfires. The major concern of these writings in the bushfire is like this is what I wanted to share with you. The essence of these writings, they engage with the society both intensely and psychologically. Now, that is a remarkable thing. But today's presentation, it draws attention to the perspectives with which these writers look at the plight and suffering of the masses. And an attempt is also made to touch on the significance of World Humanitarian Day this year. It also questions that what Australian society or even humanity does to itself during precipitating crisis of the bushfire. And it also considers, as I said, the role of climate change. In a sense, these writers engage with society quite intensely, I believe. And bushfires have always played a significant role in telling Australian stories. Contemporary writers are changing their focus from traditional bushfire narratives. They are drawing the connection between climate crisis and bushfire and showing that what is occurring in Australia has no longer to be considered natural or normal. Now they explore connections between Australia's natural world, the human, and the non human. Most of it has deeper socio-political agenda and indicates policy paralysis in the name of development politics of climate change, which directly impacts the depletion of humanitarianism. The questions that intrigue several readers and researchers worldwide are, these are very pertinent questions which I think everybody must think about. That why is it that bushfire history is filled with stories of people being taken by surprise by the fires? How can history be seared with the scars of the past bushfire disaster and yet we still seem to have learned so little? This is the second question. We certainly have an ambivalent relationship with fire. Fire has kept us warm, cooked our food, lit the dark, and cleared the land throughout for human evolution. Fire also regularly wreaks unimaginable destruction and death on our communities, threatening our safety within our own homes in a way that has profound psychological consequences for the survivors. Nevertheless, despite our long history with destructive force of fire, we remain perpetually underprepared or at times unprepared for disaster. Understanding our fear of fire and how fear has evolved within the human brain provides a powerful insight into how we respond to fire and why some people respond to fire more effectively than others. In contrast, this kind of response at times is also counterproductive. Understanding fear also explains how we prepare ourselves. Overcoming that fear provides a path for future of living safely with the flames. Now, these are the texts which I am going to talk about in the first section of my presentation. The very first text is by Ellen Cressy, that is A Lady's Visit to the Gold Digging of Australia in 1852 to 1853. This is a collection of short stories which is extremely melodramatic. The story which I am going to talk about was written in 1854, that is A Bushfire. The title of the story is Bushfire. It frequently emphasized in destructibility of homestead, which offers shelter against the hostile burning environment. Clecy's contemporary, who is another British author, that is Anthony Trollope, he wrote a book, Harry Heathcote of Gangoil. This book was published in 1874. In this book, he presses upon the need for the settlers to push aside their differences, uniting to combat the arson attacks. Different though these two stories may appear, they share the shared investment in the fire as a type of social leveler. This we have to realize that in the later half of the 19th century, the writers were thinking that maybe the fire is a great leveler, where everything is destroyed and they have to recreate the entire process of rebuilding a society. So these two writers emphasize on that. Ellen Clecy's heroine, Julia, must be rescued from fire that represents her repressed desires before she can accept the suit of the shy and socially inferior sheep farmer Hugh Clements. Trollope's Harry Heathcote must tame his arrogance and class prejudices to discover the mateship in the bush with his neighbor, Medlicott. Clecy and Trollope both explore fire. I mean, there is a third book which I'll be talking about in this. This is rather a poster, it is not a book, I would say, which says, Would you stand by while bushfire raged? And the second line, which is highlighted here, is the get busy and drive the Germans back. Now, the whole poster not only talks about bushfire, but also hints at the Second World War, the Great War. And this was released by H.J. Weston. I've included, these, cover pages of the books and this poster. The reason is that I feel that they can be read together. Then this is a very common kind of, picture which appears in number of magazines and newspapers during the bushfire. And they shape, this says that they shape Australia's landscape, but trauma burns on and on. Now, coming to that how Clecy and Trollope, they both explore fire in their texts. This is important because they have different perspective toward bushfire. So they explore fire as a plot device to bring about unity in less socially stratified country than England they knew. However, bushfires have also been mobilized in more overtly political ways during the times of conflict. When the propagation of imagined community, this is a Benedict Anderson's phrase, unified against hostile foe, formed an important propaganda tool. And then coming to that poster which I have just shown you, this is H.J. Weston's recruitment poster of 1990, which asks a question from Australians that would you stand by a while a bushfire raged? While urging, this is an urge which is expressed through that poster, get busy and drive the Germans back. The poster neatly displaces the annual trepidation and terror of the fire season onto a geographical distant enemy. Moreover, given the debates about nationhood and the sacrifice of young Australian men for a different mother country that articulated throughout the Great War, Western's poster masterfully transforms the European conflict into urgent and pressingly familiar problem. Western draws on a threat that is instantly familiar to all Australians, which brings a unique sense of national identity. Now, having said that, in the next slide, you will come across this term Black Friday. This refers to the fires of January 1939, so earlier half of the 20th century. It killed 71 people and burned nearly 2 million hectares of land. Although Black Friday was most extreme day because of its. Now, about this, H.G. Wells, who is again a British author, he talks about it because perhaps he was there in those years. So he talks about the Black Friday, and because it's a strong winds, the fires had been raging since December and continued for much of January. You know, while living in northern hemisphere, we think that when there is winter here, it is winter everywhere. But that is the time when Australia is experiencing extreme summers, and it is the phenomena which occurs during the summers. The strong winds, the fires had been raging since December and continued for much of January. While H.G. Wells was not in Victoria to witness the most intense days of the fire, Wells visited the state between January 4th and January 10th, touring some of the fire-affected areas with Governor General, having written so vividly of fire in his 1895 novel, The Time Machine. I hope you people are aware of it, that he was, what do you call, scientific fiction writer, and Time Machine is one of the prominent or the world classics in science fiction. It is hardly surprising that Wells has drawn to what he describes that as that steaming smoke curtain. He wrote of his experiences in the article Bushfires, and which appeared in the News Chronicle in England on January 30th, 1939, and was later republished in the Travels of Republican in Search of Hot Water. He says that I anticipated an advancing wall of flames, leaving blackness behind, being held back by natural and artificial clearings, by beating and by water. The reality was not like that. A bushfire is not an orderly invader, but a guerrilla. It advances by rushes, by little venomous tongues of fire in the grass. It spreads by the sparks, burning leaves and bark. Its front is miles deep. It is here, it is there, like a swarm of venomous wasps. It shams dead and stabs you in the back. What could be more pictorial than this? And what could be more explicit explanation of any bushfire? We can reimagine and think about it. In the next slide, I would like to highlight some more aspects of H.G. Wells' writing on bushfire. Wells was overwhelmed by both the scale and unruliness of fire. He considers fire in adverse terms, anthropomorphizing it as a malevolent invading force. As his account unfolds, he goes on to stress the camaraderie inspired by the disaster, noting that fire exhilarates and exerting with the great force that bushfire eliminate class and feuds. Now let us go back to Anthony Trollope in 1874. Both Wells and Anthony Trollope, they suggest that the destructive fires promote egalitarianism and mateship. This emphasizes on community building is one reason for the bushfire's great strength as a rhetorical tool for politicians. Yet Wells with characteristic controversy, took his analysis a step further. For Wales, Australia, and all well-wooded countries need to be vigilant and understand the harnessing of fire as a weapon. However, his discussion then broadens to consider the importance of air defense for a nation in which major cities like Perth, Adelaide, or Brisbane could be wrecked or even occupied, while Sydney or Melbourne, looked on incapable of help, are so distant from one another. Wells' conflation of fire and enemy occupation demonstrates just how threatening he found the large-scale burning. However, his imaginative leap from scorched forests to aerial bombardment seems at the face value to be big one. Bushfires hold, because of their capacity to devastate landscapes, homes, and communities, a potent and evocative place in the imaginations of many Australians. While wildfires and forest fires occur with increasing frequency across the globe, the intensity of the Australian summer renders the bushfire separate and different in terms of both its scale and difficulties involved in fighting it. The bushfire has become a repository of wide-ranging collection of emotions, and its political usage warrants a considerable degree of further scrutiny. This was the first section of my presentation. My second section concerns the World Humanitarian Day, which was celebrated on August 19, 2021. It focused this year on the climate emergency and its impact on the lives and livelihoods of the people affected by crisis, urging the world leaders to take action and support the most affected communities. An occasion to honor humanitarian action, celebrate the strength of communities, acknowledge aid workers, and pay tribute to those who have lost their lives or been injured in the course of their work. To win the race to address the climate crisis, we need to take a whole of society approach that involves the private sector in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery. If we do not act now, the number of people requiring humanitarian aid each year would reach 200 million by 2050, in part due to global climate crisis. It means that humanitarian action needs to evolve, help people adapt to the changing climate. Now, regarding this aspect of this presentation, I came across these, writers. One is Michelle Juchot. She is a novelist and a short story writer who has written this beautiful novel, The World Without Us. And the other one is Alexis Wright. She has written a book, which is of course a non-fictional book, and she's also a short story writer, and her famous novel Carpentaria is concerning the indigenous communities, their culture, and again, it even refers to environment surrounding these indigenous communities. Now, talking about Michelle Juchot, of course, I will be talking about some other writers also, like Alice and two other writers, Eliza Henry Jones and Alice Robinson, so on and so forth. So in this section, I'm going to tell you something about the current scenario. How do these writers feel concerned about climate change and the destruction due to climate change and its impact on bushfires? So Michel Juchot's novel The World Without Us, it highlights the connection between ecological disaster and human grief through its depiction of logging, mining, and significantly destructive fire in the rural communities past that alters the present lives of the novel's protagonists. In a New South Wales town surrounded by farms and mountains, this fire threatens human infrastructure and surrounding rainforest. Towns just like this are among many that have been devastated by bushfires in the recent weeks. Even last year it was terrible for Australia, if I'm not mistaken. Furthermore, Joshua is not alone. Another writer I intend to talk about is Alice Bishop. Her short story collection is A Constant Hum. It tells the fictional stories of the Black Saturday bushfire. Strong westerly winds blew the fire towards Hume Vale and Kings Lake, with embers causing spot fires up to 20 or 40 kilometers away. Eliza Henry Jones, her latest novel is Ache, which is a story of the town and family recovering from the impact of intense bushfire. Alice Robinson's Anchor Point is another fictional writing which gives rise to life-altering consequences of both fire and flood. Alexis Wright's Swan book, it addresses the strong ties between colonization and climate catastrophe in depicting near future Australia irreversibly affected uh, by climate change. The text speaks of floating ashes and flickered with fire and diesel dance. The sky is full of full-throated blizzard of heat flying over the hills. Wright's work speaks volumes of what the climate crisis means for indigenous people. So now this is something about the world without us and Wright's Swan book. Therefore, we can say that climate change is the threat multiplier. It can worsen the disruption caused by conflict and inflame existing social, economic, and environmental risk, leading to further conflicts. The foundations of societies are thrown into disarray by conflict. Everything from the economy to the environment, healthcare, infrastructure, and social cohesion is uprooted. In this context, the capacity of the people to cope with any changes, uh, it takes a backseat. It includes those resulting from changing climate and is quite limited. When climate change and conflict they mix, the results are devastating. The climate change intensifies humanitarian crisis and humanitarian action needs to adapt to meet this challenge. The climate is changing everywhere, but it is not affecting everyone in the same way. People living in the middle of conflict are particularly vulnerable to the impact of climate change. Humanitarian organizations whose mandate is to protect people's life affected by the conflict must collaborate to strengthen the climate action throughout their work. These are mobilizing those best places to mitigate climate change and facilitate climate adaptation from the governments to the local authorities, communities, and the private sector. In the conclusion, I would like to say that the fiction allows the readers to focus not only on the human plight, but on that of non-human. The World Without Us, the Swan book, the Catherine McKinnon's Storyland or Jennifer Mills' Dyschronia are just some examples of Australian eco-fiction. These books emphasize the lives of animals, plants, and more in the context of climate emergency, providing a lens that does not depict nature as an all destructive adversary. Access to the stories like these is essential. Without them, we will find it harder to imagine different ways of responding to the crisis. It is more challenging to understand the connections between natural processes and our actions, and more difficult to deeply engage with the reality of the climate emergency in Australia and elsewhere in the world. Reading Australian eco-fiction, especially that of the bushfire kind, provides the readers with alternative climate narrative. It is pushed by our elected leaders a more truthful, thoughtful, and empathetic narrative, and one that places the culpability of the crisis firmly at the feet of the people. Yes, people ultimately are responsible. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
So, with your permission, let me begin. Good morning, one and all. I should begin with an apology because I had a technical issue here, so I could not start the program in time. Now my audio is fine, right? I'm really happy to be a part of this virtual international conference on Australian bushfire and its different dimensions. Of course, when we look at the theme of the conference, we all know that it is very relevant, and more importantly, it has a transnational dimension. Recently, I came across a report of Forest Survey of India, FSI. In FSI's report, which came out last year, approximately 20.1% of forest resources in India is under threat because of this fire. Forest fire is also a problem in Northeast as well as the central part of India as per the report. The report was prepared based on the history of forest fire from 2004 to approximately 2017 or so. So basically, I feel that what we need is a new politics. We know that we all are living in a period of climate crisis. So we cannot focus only on Australian bushfires alone. So we all are going to suffer this in the future. To take the case of Kerala, sir, yes, sir, we have witnessed 2 floods, and we can see climate change happening in our state. Recently, there are reports that peacocks are coming out from forest areas. Recently I witnessed a few of them in my place also, because of the increase in the temperature. Right? Experts say that that's because of the increase in the temperature. If you look at the first part of the title of the conference, who started the bushfires? There are so many theories. We all live in a period of post-truth. So there are so many conspiracy theories. Human beings are responsible. And there are natural reasons. Even there are some other interesting observations, such as extraterrestrials beings. They are responsible for bushfires in Australia. There are so many theories. So who started bushfires? Apart from identifying the reasons, apart from identifying the causes of these bushfires, particularly in the Australian context, I would argue that it is even more important for us to look at this problem in a different way. What's the solution for it? Who can stop bushfires? Let's think of this question. Who can stop bushfires? Or what can stop bushfires? Here, as a student of literature, I think of the possibility of narratives or stories, as our eminent resource person has clearly sketched out the history of writings on bushfires. I remember him talking about H.G. Wells, Anthony Trollope, and of course Alexis Wright. So, as a student of literature, when I think of it, the question comes to my mind: can stories or narratives save the world from bushfires or climate change? So, what exactly is the role of literature? And here, I look at the possibility of what we call ecological literary studies. So, how literature can cure, or how literature can reframe our minds to create a state of mind in which we become more empathetic towards nature, not only towards human beings, but towards ecosystem as general. So to create, as I pointed out, to create the importance of the possibility of literature uh, to remind us about our what we call the culture of greed, okay, our culture of greed, the culture of narcissism, or what we call our destructive nature, destructive tendency. Okay. So, can writings inspire us with a set of attitudes or habits which can positively help us to look at ecosystem in general. So how these literary environments are depicted in different writings. And I totally agree with the speaker's observation that what we need is a sort of community building. Okay. We need bondings, sort of community building to create this awareness. So writings can also create an awareness, a social awareness, which will help us to rethink, our approach towards nature. Right. I also agree with the statement made by Professor Trikha that we need to look at the role of private sector also. We should take private sector also under consideration. Of course, we can find fault with the coal mining and other issues raised by these multinational agencies. But in disaster management, we can also look at the possibility of bringing them into the fold, right? So a couple of more observations. So when I was fascinated by the observations made by one Andrew Hubel and John Ryan. So Andrew Hubel and John Ryan, so they discussed the question of reading strategy, and here comes the notion of ethics also. Okay, then how do we read these texts and narratives and stories? What all strategies do we adopt? So regarding the reading, how do we read these narratives in which environments are constructed or narrated? Okay, and they put forward two types of reading literary narratives. One is thinking about literature. We think about literature. When we think about literature, we think through historical lens. So thinking about literature through historical lens. And secondly, thinking with literature. I think that would be more interesting. Thinking with literature. That means the readers also participate. Readers also, as readers, we can also participate in text imaginative work of constructing an environment. So we also take part in it's a proactive reading in which we also take part in the construction of literary environment of the text. So ultimately, I think what is more important is to see it new, I would say, to see it new. So we have to be conscious, we have to be more conscious, and we have to be more alert. And I would say that literature or narratives in general, they are powerful enough uh, to motivate us to rethink our strategies uh, in our approach towards not only towards Australian bushfires but also towards climate crisis in general. Right? So these are some of my observations, uh, and as I told you at the beginning, I could not listen to the entire lecture because of some technical issues here. Um, I was particularly you know interested in the speaker's strategy of evolving the history of nature writing, particularly H.G. Wells' contribution and how in his time machine he focused on this issue, bushfires, and how these malevolent forces uh, are involved in all these things. And so the politics of bushfires, as we talk about politics of bushfires, the ideology of bushfires. Of course, we all need a politics, a positive politics to save our world. And as students, I repeat, as students of literature, I'm sure that we have got our own role. Let policymakers, they take their own initiative. Let economists, they their own initiatives. But as students, as students of literature, as lovers of literature, when we negotiate cultural texts, how cultural texts or narratives, how they discuss this issue, bushfires, particularly in in the case of Australian literature, and not only Australian literature, writings in general. And I'm really happy to listen to such a wonderful lecture by an expert scholar in the field of Australian literature. And I think that the audience can raise a few questions to the lecture, the plenary lecture. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Rajesh. Thank you very much.